L'ordre du jour appelle les déclarations du Conseil et de la Commission.
The next item on the agenda is statements by the Council and the Commission on the European 2020 strategy for growth and employment, and I'll give the floor first of all to Mr. López Garrido on behalf of Council.
Señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President.
Tengo el gusto de abordar un asunto de la máxima importancia.
This is hugely important to Council and the Spanish Presidency. The Europe 2020 strategy for jobs and growth. And when I say jobs, I mean quality jobs. As we said before, we're emerging from the worst economic crisis since the 1930s, and we're doing all we can to guarantee that this recovery, which is beginning in the European Union, should continue. And at the same time, we want to palliate the social consequences of the crisis where it continues. We also want to work in the short term, along with Member States and other European institutions. We need to look beyond the short term, though, and look at the end of this decade and guarantee that the European social model can continue. That's the twin challenge that we face, and we're trying to deal with it through Europe 2020. We don't want to go back to undergoing a crisis which is still not yet fully over, and we want to try to do it in particular by setting up a growth strategy, a growth model which is in line with the 21st century and is also something which is doable and is something which we know we have to do. It's a big economic and political commitment that the European Union is going to enter into for the next few years. Honourable members will be fully aware that the 2020 strategy began to be discussed, at least informally, on the 11th of February. It was then dealt with in the March Council, the European Council, and was debated also in many of the other Council formations during the 6 months of the Spanish Presidency. The March Council green-lighted the launching of the 2020 strategy. It'll take definitive form in the June Council, and Council also laid down the elements and the structure, the roadmap, if you like, of the way 2020 will eventually look. It's going to deal with key issues for Europe: knowledge, innovation, sustainable economy, and as the Parliament's also called for, we're going to look for a high level of employment. We've got 5 key goals. They've already put figures as far as achieving inclusive employment: 25% more for men and women, more research and development, the various 20-20-20 goals in the battle against climate change. We haven't yet put a figure for the figures of trying to keep people in school, nor for the promotion of social integration and particularly the reduction of poverty. No figures there yet. It'll all be done on the basis of the communication adopted by the Commission, and which was crucially important in shaping the conclusions and the decisions that the Council took in March. The structure of the 2020 strategy has got some guidelines built into it. Commission made its proposal on these guidelines. Spanish Presidency committed itself to working on all of those areas which fall within the Council's remit. So EPSCO and ECOFIN will brief the Council in June, and the employment guidelines, which will of course require some input from the European Parliament. Then we've got the principal goals that I mentioned earlier. Thirdly, this is a innovation, national goals. Each member state needs to set its national goals, they of course have to be integrated into the European goals and agreed to by Commission and Council. We also talked about the bottlenecks which are stopping growth at national level. It's a new thing. Thanks to Lisbon, the Spanish presidency is going to look at those elements which affect the internal market. And we've also got 50 the so-called flagship initiatives, where these are being developed further by the Commission. The first one, which we hope will come through during the Spanish presidency, the digital agenda. That was discussed in May, or will be discussed, I beg your pardon, in May in the Telecommunications Council. And we hope to publish a document on that on May the 18th. To wind up, Madam President, let me say that there are going to be certain specific debates on some of these elements in Council, and we would like these debates to be public as far as possible. There's going to be an education discussion next week. Obviously, June isn't going to see the end of this. That's when the strategy is going to be announced and launched, but that's not the end of it. It has to be developed through the national reform programs. It has to be implemented. And let me say also that as far as the governance of the strategy is concerned, this is something that the Spanish presidency has backed and the Council has backed in general, as well as President Van Rompuy. The Union's going to play a very important role in developing the strategy, and Parliament will, along with the Commission, help turn the strategy in the correct direction and help implement it. There are already instruments in place, and we're all very keen to avail ourselves of these instruments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. López Garrido. I'll now give the floor to Mr. Barroso on behalf of the Commission.
Madam Chair, Chairperson, Mr. Minister, honourable members. Europe has been presented with a stark choice. We could take a beggar thy neighbour approach to the economic and financial crisis, a sauve-qui-peut attitude that would risk everything we have achieved over the last 60 years. Or we could increase European cooperation in an effective way, using all tools at our disposal. Events over the last few months, namely continuing market volatility, the need for further financial market reforms, the need for determined consolidation of public finances, have only increased the clarity of this choice. We need to stress the importance of the European dimension more than ever. And we have an opportunity to do that precisely around the objectives of Europe 2020. I've been invited to talk to you about Europe 2020, but looking at this package of measures for smart, sustainable, inclusive growth in isolation does not really make sense. Because one of the key conclusions we can draw from the crisis that we are now living is that we have to work together at all levels and in all areas to fill the gaps in the framework for regulation and supervision of the financial markets, to restore macroeconomic stability and sound public finances, to launch the structural reforms that can steer Europe to a path of sustainable growth and jobs. All these three volets matter equally. We need to get it right in all three if we are to meet our objectives. So all this demands a holistic approach. Financial markets reforms, reinforced economic governance, Europe 2020 for sustainable, inclusive, smart growth, leading global reforms through the G20, because many of these matters have external dimension. So we have to use all the levers at our disposal in an intelligent way, recognizing that each one has an impact on all the others. Let me touch briefly on most of them. I will not come back to the financial issues I just mentioned in the previous statement, but let me mention the G20 to start with. The G20 has been instrumental in addressing the financial and economic crisis, improving governance on a more global level. The European Union can take a large share of the credit for giving the impetus to the G20 and feeding it with ideas. The Commission has made a particular contribution to this, ensuring that the interests of all 27 member states are properly reflected in our work. We will work hard to ensure the European Union maintains its leadership at the Toronto Summit in June and the Seoul Summit in November. A key objective will be to get a clear message from the G20 on an exit strategy to support recovery, one where all major economies play their part. We have to address globally some of the imbalances that were indeed at the origin of this crisis. We should also ensure that the burden of rebalancing global growth is shared by all G20 members. Raising awareness of our strategy for Europe 2020, enhanced economic coordination in the European Union in general and the euro area in particular will be important in this context. It is important that Europe presents a coordinated approach to the G20. Another objective will be driving on with financial market reform. We need to keep up pressure on our international partners to deliver the timely and consistent implementation of the existing commitments. We need a level playing field. Over and above this, I believe time is right for G20 to send a strong signal on how the financial sector can contribute to the financing of bank repair. We should strive for a coordinated and strong approach. A global agreement on bank stability levies linked to concrete resolution measures would send a strong signal. As the IMF recently suggested, this could be complemented by a tax on financial activities or profits. It's going to be an extremely difficult debate, I have to tell you. From the preparatory work going on with our partners in the G20, there are many that oppose this idea. Nevertheless, I think we should pursue it. The European Union message will certainly be strongest if we speak with one voice and if you can say that the European Union has already done its homework. That is why before Toronto we should aim to have agreement on the key financial services regulation files I mentioned earlier this afternoon, that will require flexibility and creative pragmatism from both this House and from the Council. And this brings me to the core of Europe 2020, now placed in its proper context as part of this holistic approach I talked about at the beginning. As you know, the main elements of Europe 2020 strategy were adopted by heads of state and government in March. We have had several occasions to debate them in this House. Even before we have made the proposal, the Commission, we have consulted you about this. We now have to flesh the strategy out in detail. The urgent need for action is clear to all, more than ever. I think, and that was highlighted in some of the statements made in the previous debate, one of the conclusions of this financial crisis and the problems of the euro area is the need to go ahead with structural reform in a coordinated, determined manner. Better coordination of our economic policies is the centrepiece of Europe 2020. Even before this Greek crisis, we have been suggesting, we have been proposing more coordination of economic policies. This is clearly necessary in order to avoid future crises. It is essential if you want to exit the crisis successfully, restore growth, translate that growth into more and better jobs, and ultimately ensure a sustainable, inclusive future for Europe. The 5 targets proposed by the Commission are now largely consensual. Numerical rates have already been fixed concerning targets on employment, R&D, and the fight against climate change. The numerical target for the education objective, reducing school dropout rates, increasing the share of the population with tertiary or equivalent education, will be agreed by the European Council in June 2010, taking into account the proposal of the Commission. I am also strongly committed to getting a numerical target on the fight against poverty and social exclusion. We simply cannot accept the continuing scandal of 80 million people at risk of poverty in the European Union. Work is continuing in the Council on this issue, and I will do all I can to convince Member States of the importance of this target, knowing that this House shares our determination. Europe 2020 must be a balanced programme. Of course, you cannot have social equity without a competitive market, but nor are we willing to accept a Europe of economic efficiency without fairness. The national targets will enable a better and more efficient monitoring of the progress of the Member States to ensure that we achieve the objectives set at European level. Member States are in the process of setting these national targets in cooperation with the Commission. The targets, I hope, will be agreed at the June European Council so that implementation can start immediately after. The Commission issued a proposal on integrated guidelines last week. They reflect the priorities of the Europe 2020 strategy. The number of guidelines is more limited than last time. Now we have 10 as opposed to 24, which will encourage ownership, readability of the instrument by all the different actors. I think this is a progress. The June European Council should give political endorsement to the principles behind these integrated guidelines, but of course they will only be adopted after we have discussed them with you, the European Parliament, which I hope can be as soon as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be clear, the Europe 2020 strategy is not just an aspirational list of objectives. It's not just a vision, it is a reform programme. Action will be taken at European level. But equally important is the fact that reforms will have to be made in each of our 27 member states in full respect of the principle of subsidiarity. We will make it clear what has to be done at European level and what has to be done at national level. And implementation will be key. As was said by the distinguished representative of the Council, Mr. López Garrido, there has been now a much stronger awareness at member states level of the need for reinforcing the European governance. I hope that member states have learned with some of the shortcomings of the Lisbon strategy, where in fact many of the objectives, if not all of the objectives, were good in the right direction, but there was not, let's be frank, enough sense of ownership and not enough muscle in the implementation of the programmes. That is why we need to close this delivery gap that prevailed under the Lisbon strategy. And for that, you have a crucial role to play ensuring the successful implementation of the Europe 2020 strategy. The European Parliament, apart from your role as co-legislator, you can also very effectively mobilise citizens. And also, why not, the national parliaments. I think it is critically important, the kind of relation, if I may say this to you, that the Parliament, European Parliament, establishes with national parliaments, so that we are sure that these reforms are seen not only as the reforms they someday make in Brussels or sometimes in Strasbourg, but that we make at all levels in the European societies. The sense of urgency, the need for reforms must be shared by all key social, economic and political players at all levels of the government, but also namely by the social partners. I believe it is very important, and I welcome all the announcements made by Prime Minister Zapatero regarding the need to involve these social partners. And then we must ensure stronger joined-up governance by tying all our coordination instruments together, Europe 2020 and Stability and Growth Pact, reporting and evaluation carried out simultaneously to bring the means and aims together. Input from the European Systemic Risk Board to ensure overall financial stability. Structural reforms, measures to increase competitiveness, macroeconomic developments, all coming together to get us out of the crisis and firmly on the road to smart, sustainable and inclusive growth. If we want to be serious about economic governance, that's the only way to do it. That's the only way to do it. We cannot speak of serious economic governance at European level and separate the macroeconomic from the microeconomic, separate the internal from the external. So we need the Member States and European institutions to look at these matters in a holistic approach and putting all those instruments together. That's the only way to instil some confidence as well in our strategy. I spoke of a stark choice at the beginning of my statement, and the Commission knows which paths it wants to take. I am confident this House shares that choice, a choice of determination, a choice for Europe, and I count on your input as we continue our work. Thank you for your attention.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Thank you. I now give the floor to the spokesman for the groups, Mrs. WORTMANN-KOOL.
Thank you very much indeed, President. Mr. Barroso, Minister, the debate about the 2020 strategy has quite rightly been preceded by a debate about the crisis in the Eurozone, and for both the crucial issue is about European governance and strengthening European governance. And you've been talking about coordination of economic policy, but the major problem is that this is something which is not that's been dealt with under the heading of the more freedom the better. But if we're talking about the Stability and Growth Pact, we have to learn the lessons of the Lisbon strategy. We have to take a different approach as regards the 2020 strategy. The EPP, our political group, expects ambition of the Commission, ambition in its efforts to deal with European governance in the 2020 strategy, and we want to see ambitious objectives being set by Council as well. We want to have firmer European governments, we want to have more, stronger European governments. And budgetary plans in future will have to take account and factor in the 2020 strategy, and the Parliament in it will have to play its institutional role. We have to act in the interests of creating jobs and creating sustainable European growth. Turbulence in the Eurozone has demonstrated yet again the importance of healthy public finances, the stability of the euro and financial and economic stability, but also to prevent our passing on the burdens to future generations, to our children. Reforming public finances is a precondition for a successful 2020 strategy, and indeed it is essential for the restoration of our competitiveness. So Commissioner Rehn, it's vital that you should come up with proposals about how to bolster the Stability and Growth Pact. We have to look at the preventive side. We need to look at sustainable public finances, and these are all vital components. And I would also urge you on behalf of our group to take on board your responsibility as a Commission and to deliver ambitious plans. You can count on our support. And as a Parliament, we have to look and see how we can challenge the Council, together with you, to go along with the strengthening of the Stability and Growth Pact. I think it's a good thing that the Council has set up a task force. However, I really hope that before the end of the year, the Council will give its approval to the proposals of the Commission. President, the opportunities which arise as a result of the Lisbon Treaty have to become a reality. We don't have any time to lose. Thank you.
Thank you, and now I give the floor to Mrs. Berès for 3 minutes. Thank you, Madam President. President of the Commission, President in Office, the link between the two debates that we're having now is logical intellectually, but is that link actually put into practice? We have our doubts in the S&D group, because when we look at the text that is being put to us by the Commission, and when we see that in a kind of strategic partnership you want to adopt this in June without giving the Parliament the opportunity to comment explicitly on the integrated guidelines for employment, and we don't really see the consistency in your actions. You want us to commit ourselves for the next 10 years without taking stock of the Lisbon strategy. You say that everything has changed, that we no longer have 27 guidelines, we just have 10, but is that really the change, President of the Commission? Consistency is to say that if we want to make a success of the 2020 strategy, we have to start from where we are, not just thinking about where we're going. But where we are today is embroiled in the worst crisis that the EU has known since its inception. We haven't been through a worse crisis than this, so we can't ignore that fact. We can't have an exit strategy which is just an abdication of the responsibilities of member states for economic policy and just leaving everything up to the market. We can't think of an exit strategy from the crisis without thinking about the problems of the tools that we have available to us. We're not as rich as all that. We've got one tool, it's the Stability Pact. We've got other ones called the financial perspectives. But if we don't clearly make use of these, we won't make progress. And if we look at the point of departure, there are causes for concern. First of all, we, Socialists and Democrats, demand as a matter of urgency to address the problem of speculation on the markets. And it's not just a problem of Greece or any other member state. It's a question of the domino effect and giving free rein to speculation. That is why we are proposing the establishment of a financial stability mechanism that will make it possible to shelter member states from this speculation so that they can do what they have to, which is to embark on the course to recovery, which will enable them to preserve our social model. Because everybody knows this, and everybody has said this in the crisis, our social model is our best asset in globalization. And if your 2020 strategy is tantamount simply to budgetary consolidation, which strangles that social model, well then, tomorrow, Europe will be undermined in global competition, and it will lose its capacity to hold up its principles and the social model that we represent, and will just crumble away and give a free hand to other continents. That's not our vision of the future.
Thank you, Mrs. Berès. Mrs. Ek, 3 minutes, please.
Merci. We have known for many months that Greece is in a very difficult position. We know that the euro is depreciating at a rapid rate in front of our eyes, and the government bond spreads are rising. No one can still doubt that Europe is in a serious crisis, just when we thought that we were back on our feet again. So we seriously need to address the issues of competitiveness, of productivity, and of sustainable economic growth. But still the leaders of Europe are bickering about what action to take. This is not the time. We need real action, and we need it now. Since it's apparent that peer pressure in Council doesn't work, we need binding targets and new transparent means to scrutinise the reports about each member state. We need a fundamental respect for the Stability and Growth Pact, and we need reliable and true figures that we can base our decisions on. And to put additional pressure on governments, structural funds and other European support must be tied to governments' ability to provide us with correct figures. Let me make a comparison. When a small farmer mistakes on half a hectare, he loses out, or she loses out, on her support for everything that she does for a number of years. That is the comparison we have to make. That's why we are so tough on governance in the parliamentary resolutions. It's most embarrassing also that the Commission is not putting forward proposals that we've been discussing for years and years and years. And to create a platform for future growth, a strategic policy agenda must be included in the EU 2020 strategy. Let me take some examples. We negotiated the economic recovery plan. Most of it is not enforced, and the Parliament asked that we should have a plan B, so it's included in the results, but the plan B is not set into action yet. We have decided on a set plan, new energy technology. We still miss 50% of the funding for the set plan, a real strategic tool. And the most cost-effective means to reduce greenhouse gases is to move forward with a strategy for energy efficiency. So I therefore call on the Commission and the Member States to put energy efficiency at the top of the agenda in action. The existing legislation must be stepped up because it's not providing, and we need the so long promised energy efficiency action plan. We need energy infrastructure. The energy equivalent of fast trains, supergrids and high-tech smart grids is needed, and we do have the money for this. We need to ensure technical innovation, and we need also to encourage and put forward a strategy to combat social exclusion and gender inclusion. And in the light of the current crisis, the Commission must step up to its responsibility and finish what we started together, and the Council has to be more bold and stop bickering. We will put forward a bold resolution on the second step of the 2020 strategy.
Thank Thank you, Mrs. Ek. Mrs. Harms, 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that we are bordering on political provocation if we're saying that the 2020 programme is going to be a major step towards getting out of the crisis. I mean, here, look at the financial markets. If you are halfway honest, you will say that for months now, in fact, for years on end, we've been promising that we would regulate these markets, but so far we've only taken baby steps rather than giant steps. And Greece is now confronted with a crisis, and we've seen that not nearly enough has been done. Our citizens have been told that we have to bail out the banks. With much gnashing of teeth, they accepted that, and now public finances are overstretched because of these measures. Now we're bailing out Greece, and there's no doubt that a further challenge to public budgets in many countries of the EU will result. Now, banks are in the black, and people are applauding when there's talk of voluntary participation in what's going on in Greece. Now, we're saying that in the EU we have a market composed of 27 member states, and we want to have a financial transaction tax or some other instrument so that the appetite of speculators to make profits can be diminished. What we really do need is an instrument which we can make use of to tackle the issue of people who are making a profit from the crisis. We have to look at what we're funding, because really with public money we can't pursue what we have been pursuing up to now by way of a policy. Now, we have to look at this whole business of this being dealt with globally. We're familiar with this from the climate change debate, but we haven't made progress. Obviously, the climate is the second big issue as far as I'm concerned. In fact, we've sunk more deeply into the crisis, and really I think it's really quite sad that before this debate Connie Hedegaard is working like a mole in the Commission and is trying to get through the minimum target. I mean, if you look at the current situation, it's long overdue that we should increase the percentages that we're talking about to 30%. We've been talking about European emissions trading. If we don't increase our target, then the emission trading scheme is something we can forget. If we don't have an appropriate price because our targets, our objectives are not ambitious enough, we're still a long way off the kind of objectives we need. We've been talking about the transformation of the European economy to move it towards sustainability. Now look, you can see this kind of thing mentioned in the titles of Commission documents. Everybody says, yes, we want to be involved, we want to do that. But Mr. Barroso, your Commission hasn't really delivered the goods when it comes to talking about how these objectives can be translated into measures. And in fact, a number of topics have already been dealt with by previous speakers. I think a lot of work needs to be done on this programme, and what we've done up to now on that, I don't think the Parliament can say after Lisbon this is going to be the big plan to follow. But 2020 is emerging from the failure of Lisbon, and we don't want to see it be a failure itself.
Thank you, Mrs. Harms. Mr. Kamiński for 3 minutes, sorry.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think that President Barroso has probably one of the most difficult roles to play today, one of the most difficult occupations to perform in the whole of the EU, because not only must he divide his time into convincing the left wing and the right wing people who have the best answers for the most difficult problems, so among all those proposals he has to sort of swim swiftly, if you like, and I believe that the 2020 proposal proposed by the Commission finds no better equivalent. I'm bewildered to hear, even in this room, proposals today that one way to redress the situation that we are in that's difficult would be to repeat our mistakes. Let me say that I spent 18 years of my life in a country called the People's Republic of Poland, in which country we had the Ministry of Domestic Trade, and we had empty bookshelves. We had the Ministry of Internal Trade, but there was no internal trade to speak of. For 20 years, thank goodness, we don't have that ministry in Poland, and we do have domestic trade in place. So let me say that one recipe for the current crisis is definitely not to have more regulation, surely not to have more taxes, or to have more intervention. Surely, I'm not one of the fanatics of free market. I believe that the role of the state is to adjust market mechanisms, but this role has to be exercised very cautiously. I repeat, very cautiously, because let me also say that if we want to talk about development in Europe in honest terms, then you must remember how you voted during the Service Directive during the previous term. Please remember what happened to the Service Directive in this House, and yet without the full flow of people, services and capital, Europe will not be able to compete with other continents worldwide. Today we hear voices saying that we are not able to compete with other areas of political and economic integration. After all, we ourselves, with too much regulation, with too many burdens on entrepreneurship, we asked entrepreneurs of Europe to go elsewhere. So please let us ask ourselves a question: what could we do better to support this strategy? Because there isn't any other, and yet we need to exit the crisis. Likewise, there are no doubts as to the fact that we need to support Greece, because here I speak not only in my hat of the head of the Conservatives, but also as a Pole. For us, solidarity is extremely important. So today we need to show solidarity with Greece today. No two ways about it. Let me reiterate, we must do everything for Europe to rise from the economic crisis, which is not only a problem for millions of families, but also is a matter of us believing in the future. I do believe in the future of Europe and in our success. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kaminski. Mrs. Zimmer, 2.5 minutes, please.
Now, when I think of the debate on the previous agenda item and compare it with this agenda item, it seems that we're talking about two parallel worlds. On the one hand, we've got a European Union in which countries such as Greece, Italy, Spain and Portugal are in the throes of a crisis, and other countries such as Germany and France are blocking things. And on the other hand, we've got a European Union which is developing a strategy which doesn't really cut the mustard in terms of tackling the problems. Now here we have to look at the future development of the EU. We don't have responses that would tackle the problem of non-functioning instruments. We have to look at the relationship between the Eurozone and those countries within the EU which do not belong to the Eurozone. I mean, we've got a whole raft of issues which were relevant to the Lisbon strategy, but we didn't pick up on them, and we certainly didn't come up with a response to them. We need to try to figure out what we want the European Union to become. And I think, with a view to the debate on European economic governance and the European Monetary Fund, it's not possible to behave as if we can continue along identical lines with the strategy. Now, if we're talking about implementing the 2020 strategy, we really ought to take our time over this and take more time over this. We have to look at what challenges we can expect, what we have to deliver, and we have to involve others in the process to a far greater extent. Otherwise, we're wandering into the crisis with our eyes open.
Thank you, Mrs. Zimmer. Mr. Bloom, please. 1.5 minutes.
Did you call me?
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
You. Yes, yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I didn't hear you. And it's a shame Mr. Barroso has fled the chamber. I feel he would have learned so much from me this evening. I would counsel you all not to worry too much about the EU in 2020, because I rather fancy it won't be here. It will go the same way as the Soviet Union, which it so resembles, and for the same reasons. It's centralised, it's corrupt, it's undemocratic, and it's incompetent. It's driven by an unholy alliance of big business and fat cat bureaucrats. It's sponsored by an eco-fascist agenda from a platform of perverted junk science referred to as climate change. Whenever people of Europe get the chance of a referendum, they reject it. The British, of course, have not been given the chance to have their say, thanks to the deceit of the only 3 parties with access to television debate in my country, aided and abetted by an EU-corrupted public service broadcasting known as the BBC. The EU is already crumbling. The seeds in Greece today will spread through the other Mediterranean countries sooner than we can imagine, and they will eventually reach northern European countries who are being left to pick up the tab. Our children and our grandchildren will curse us as they are left to pick up the pieces of this wholly avoidable shambles.
Merci, Monsieur Bloom. Et la parole...
Thank you, Mr. Bloom. Our next speaker, Mr. Obermayr. 1 minute.
Danke, Frau Vorsitzende.
Thank you, Madam President. Intelligent or smart, sustainable growth, all sorts of fine words and ambitious goals, but I do have a few questions to raise that cause concern to me. Will the new strategy suffer the same fate as the preceding strategy? How can regional and local authorities be involved to make sure the strategy is really successful? And how can national budgets be put on a sound footing? A lot of questions to be asked, and when it comes to the solutions, we need to be careful to ensure that we're not getting in a sort of centralising economic government through the back door, undermining national sovereignty. Sovereignty, of course, means responsibility. The consequences for a bad fiscal policy have to be borne. Member states shouldn't be living beyond their means at the expense of others. A centralising economic government in Europe would be dictating mediocrity to everybody. Thank you. I'll give the other speakers the floor, beginning with Mr. Hökmark for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I think it is important that we talk about good governance, in the sense that, of course, it's important that we put pressure on all of us to do the reforms that are needed. But let us not forget that the main good governance that we have in our own hands is to secure that the European Union does what the European Union should do. And there we have had some shortcomings. How we have upheld the Stability and Growth Pact is one of those. Let's not forget that before we construct new rules, that we need to stick to the most fundamental rules. But let me also point to some other things. Regarding financial markets, let's talk about financial markets as a part of the economy, not as a separate sector. Because we will never get the investments and the new jobs if we think this is a separate issue. And I was a little bit disturbed when I noted that the chairman of the Basel II committee assumed that the new rules for capital requirement will lower economic growth with 1%. And that is a rather low level from him. Because if we are increasing the capital requirement, that might lead to less investments. And that is really not what we need to do when we are to create a new confidence in the European economy at the same time as we are exiting from the budget deficits we have. let me point to one of the things we really can do together, and that is to create the knowledge economy. It is a paradox that the more our societies and economies are turning into knowledge economies, the less internal market we have. Because the internal market was legislated for industry and the old time of economy, and less for the service sector, where we need to go further on regarding the service directive. But let me also say we should be implementing a reform making European universities more independent and more European, open for students and researchers, and creating a dynamic development in the knowledge society. Let's stick to all the things we can do together on European level. That is the best European good governance we can have. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Obermayr. Monsieur Hökmark. Et la parole est maintenant.
Thank you, Mr. Hökmark. I now give the floor to Mrs. Ulvskog. Thank you, Madam President. I come from the same member state as the previous speaker, but I'm on the left wing in terms of politics. And in fact, this is a report that we Social Democrats are responsible for. We're looking at the situation in the world in general. We're looking at the situation in Greece, and we've seen another general strike. Desperation and annoyance about the way that the market has been playing with people's lives. And here we have to look at the core having let down Greece. But you know, the crisis is contagious. It's a danger for all countries. Very few countries can count themselves safe. And this is something which requires all of us to roll up our sleeves and get involved in crisis management and combating the crisis. We don't want to adopt any short-term, short-sighted solutions in trying to put out the fire, which would then reignite and become a conflagration. So what we have to do is to try to ensure that we continue to get to grips with the problems. In the June summit, we have to follow the course that the previous speaker was talking about, was alluding to. It's important that the summit should give clear undertakings that Europe should continue to stimulate investments, that Europe should reduce unemployment amongst women, men, old and young. And I was disappointed about the equality of opportunity approach that actually was presented at the last ministerial Council of Ministers level meeting. So what we have to do is to move towards a climate-smart society, and we have to realise that every cloud has a silver lining, in the sense that every crisis can give us the opportunity to make changes. The Commission allowed Mrs. Hedegaard to have some leeway to come up with a climate change policy that would make a difference in Europe, and which is relevant to the debate in Cancun. Now, we also have to look at what an American professor said. He said that in the USA, they're saying that you can't regulate the financial markets because it's not being done in Europe. We need that, but we don't dare do it. Now, he was saying that they can't regulate. If you look at what's being said in Europe, they're saying that you can't regulate financial markets in Europe because they're not being regulated in the USA. I mean, there are a lot of losers and very few winners, so we have to have the courage to make changes in Europe now.
Thank you. Herr Klinz, bitte, für 1,5 Minuten.
Mr. Grins, 1.5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, economic practice and strategy is only as good as proper monitoring and implementation. Here the Commission has got to respond. We've got goals which we can endorse. We hear about intent, but no specifics about how to get there. I assumed that at the beginning of the Commission's thinking, well, basically what was behind it was the credit crunch, the crisis. Now it's got worse because of sovereign debt. But I think both crises should be behind this, because they've really changed the situation, having both of them now. So if we really want to do something, not just stay at the level of intent over the next decade, then there's a whole series of specific points we have to be addressed. First of all, we need in the EU some sort of proper source of money, know where we are, what is our finance, what is the framework, some sort of mechanism which will allow us not to be unhorsed in the future, but to give us some sort of realistic framework. And we've also got to complete the internal market where it's not yet completed. We've got Mario Monti's report as a guide for that, includes services. And there we've got to establish how a single monetary policy or currency policy can be supplemented with fiscal policy and finance policy, which is joined together. Now, what about the divergencies we see in differences between member states? We've got to replace that with more and more convergence, focusing in on a genuine European set of economic projects, energy policy, high-speed train, that sort of thing, navigation systems and that sort of thing. Thank you. You only had 1.5 minutes. I must remind you of that. Mrs. Turunen, 1.5 minutes.
Tak. Jeg vil starte med at sige, at arbejdet med den her 2020-strategi.
Thank you. The 2020 strategy is quite clearly extremely important, and we have to think long and hard about what we want for the future of Europe. We need to decide what the very many people in Europe in future should do. We need specific objectives in various sectors, and that's the top priority for the next 10 years. Youth unemployment must be rolled right back. Youth unemployment is alarmingly high in all member states. A first guarantee for young people should be introduced in order to enable them to get a foot on the rung of the career ladder. Poverty eradication is a further objective. Technical considerations like squabbles over the definition of poverty eradication should not slow the process down. With the Treaty of Lisbon, this really should be possible. And then we need a binding employment plan, green investments to generate jobs, training opportunities, new job opportunities. Moreover, specific objectives have to be defined for a green Europe with green jobs where quality and quantity go hand in hand. Those must be our priorities. And 2020 as a strategy is simply not good enough.
Please. I'm a tolerant man, but we have to observe our timetable. Mr. Harbour, for 1 minute.
Mr. President, I want to talk about a lack of ambition that I see in this EU 2020 strategy for the way that we can use the instruments we have now, the single market, to get it to work really effectively and create those new jobs and new opportunities, the sort of thing that Mrs. Turunen was talking about. It's not good enough, and I say this to President and Council, if the Commissioner is listening, to put the single market and its achievement under this heading missing links and bottlenecks. It's far more important than that, colleagues. And it's simply not good enough to say the Commission will propose action. It's a shared venture between Commission and Member States. My committee, the Internal Market Committee, passed a report this week with a huge majority which sets out some really ambitious ideas for joint action to complete the single market. You'll get that next week in conjunction with Professor Monti's report. And let's see some fundamental changes in here, both parties. And what we want is a single market act, a set of clear political objectives to complete the single market. And we also want to see public procurement, a massively underused tool to achieve those objectives of innovation and green technology. It is hardly mentioned in this document, For heaven's sake,
time, Mr.
why are
Harbour.
we talking about these other targets when we're not actually moving on what we have already?
Thank you. Madam Figueiredo, 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, President. This strategy doesn't really respond to the serious problems we're having to face. Even less does it face up to the economic and social disaster which free market policies imposed upon us are provoking in the weakest economy countries. It's a mistake to press home these identical policies to the same as the liberal Lisbon strategy. It's not worked. We've not had full employment and reduction of poverty. It gives priority to vested interests against labour interests and social interests. We need to look at the dry criteria in the Stability Pact and privatisation of strategic sectors and public services, including financial services in energy, transport and the post. Look at the results we've had there. Nothing. And look at the precarious nature of jobs now which are created. More than 23 million unemployed. That's the result. 5 million people are actually in poverty, genuine poverty, as against what we tend to believe. All indicators show that if we keep these sort of strategies which we've had so far, economic growth rates will be very low, below what's happening in the rest of the world. And that means basically unemployment, precarious employment, bad payment, social exclusion. Unfortunately, the community budget does not respond to getting economic and social cohesion. Look at what's happening in Greece, shows that quite clearly. And it's time to draw the necessary lessons from these wrongly conceived policies. We've got to look to social stability. It's time to stop with financial speculation and financialization of economies. We've got to stop with the Stability Pact. Look at the central bank having other tasks. Give priority to a genuine progress and development pact for social society.
Next time I will cut you off, sorry. Senor Borghezio, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, President. The fact that we're just here now discussing and assessing the contents of this 2020 strategy speaks volumes. Whilst in Athens people are dying and are people on the edge of a cliff, well, I think that speaks volumes. It's grotesque if you look at European policy here. And it's really odd that in a situation of this type the Commission does not feel it incumbent upon itself to do a bit of self-criticism. And in this crisis, and in some aspects of it, it's a dramatic situation. The Commission is just committing many serious mistakes. Look at Lisbon. It's full of them. Look at this euro thing. That's an error. Okay, it's wrong to say Greece is just out on a limb, an isolated fact. No, look what's happening in Spain. Will that be another isolated fact? A singularity? Well, we'll have lots of isolated facts and singularities, including subprime, I suppose. So it's very difficult to accept what the Commission has said at a point in time when the European Union has not yet decided to monitor its European banks and tell savers and producers the economic reality, what well, it's a compost heap really, what's hidden in there. Nobody has an idea or a whiff of what's going on. So if you're going to have a serious strategy, you've got to look at the real economy, SMEs, and give the possibility of people participating as workers and their responsibility as such.
Mr. Szegedi, 1 minute.
Tisztelt elnök úr, tisztelt képviselőtársaim, kétségkívül az Európai Unió legnagyobb.
Thank you, Mr. President. Honourable members. Neither workers nor farmers nor business people can be held to blame for the crisis. It's the economic philosophy centered around big corporations that is to blame. Small businesses have been disadvantaged. The big multinationals want the lion's share of the economy and the wealth that is to be had. We need a strategy that is focused on local and regional areas. That would be a good strategy. The Jobbik party wants to see the end of the hegemony of the big corporations, and we want to place the focus back on the little man. Mr. Royal now for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, President. We've just heard from the Presidency and the Commission that you can't follow just sauve qui peut, but you really need cooperation, mutual, decisive action. That's true, but you also need a strategy for your action. Anyway, in this 2020 project, above all, in the way in which we actually negotiate together and try to get to a decent result. I mean, if you look at everything that's going on, it's not a genuine strategy. You've got a paper here which we're supposed to think about, and it's just gone through sort of swift procedural speed. People said in Lisbon, we haven't managed to bring in people who are involved, circles who are involved. They don't feel, therefore, involved, and therefore, how can they be involved in the implementation? Now, if that's the case, we need a new strategy. We need time to do that. We need to do it at our ease and make sure that people involved, interested circles, can defend themselves. Above all, where we've got the financial crisis, and look what's going on in Greece. I mean, you can understand what's going on. You just... I'm not criticising anybody. I'm just saying, though, that here in the Parliament we've got to make sure that we do things slightly differently now. Now, in the Conference of Presidents, several people have said that we've got to be careful when we set up a schedule for implementation. Listen and think. Unfortunately, it's been accelerated. We're discussing it now, then May, and then June to Council, and it's done, tied up. So don't be amazed at the end of the whole process. You don't have any change in the actual implementation. No. We need a real negotiation and thought about part one, and not as the climate commissioner is thinking at the moment, saying, well, we've got a crisis, a crunch, and you've got the CO2 emissions which are going on at the moment. Through the crunch, can you reduce them? So you're going to look at 20, 40%? No. You've got to look at things very thoroughly and then look at what effects, what lessons you can learn when it comes to innovation and real innovation and research, and make sure it's done. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
Señor Cercas, 2 minutos.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. Thank you, President. Thank you, Mr. López Garrido. And perhaps someone could thank President Barroso on my behalf as well. I hope that your words will lead to reality and that the Summer Council will be different to the Spring Council. I fully agree with what you said, but your words aren't allaying my fears. The Council is morose and gloomy. It is full of doubts, and it is saying that the big policy objectives, even if backed by figures, might not be achievable. Mr. López Garrido, perhaps the Spanish presidency will resolve all these uncertainties, because I believe that we are going through moments that will be considered as historic moments in Europe. There are a lot of challenges, and we're talking about whether we want more Europe or less Europe. That is the objective of the Europe 2020 strategy. In 10 years, we'll either be more united or less united. There are those who believe that we should work together to deal with social economic problems, and perhaps they will win, or maybe it's the extreme nationalists that will win and who will go against what we built over 40 years. Are we going to be showing more solidarity? Are we going to be creating more wealth and distributing it fairly? Or are we going to leave everything in the hands of the markets? I don't believe that all of this has happened because there has been a lot of Europe, a lot of regulation, or on the contrary, I think it's a lack, too little Europe and too little social justice that has brought us to this. I hope you will hang on to the objectives on education, which is in the Commission text but not the Council text. And I hope you will also involve the Parliament and the citizens so that this strategy can become the agenda of the citizens and not those of the markets and therefore the speculators sometimes.
Mr. Schmidt for 1.5 minutes.
Herr talman. Greklands sak är...
Thank you very much, Mr. President. What Greece is going through is not just a matter for Euro member states, it's a matter for the whole of Europe, and we don't want to see fragmentation. It's a shame that 11 countries were absent on Friday. In Europe, we're all in the same boat. And financial market supervision does indeed need to be bolstered. We also need stricter legislation. I, as a liberal, can accept that. But it all has to happen in a balanced way, and it needs to be coordinated in a holistic sense. Robust action is necessary when appropriate, but blind panic is undesirable. We need to keep a cool head because there has been a degree of economic recovery in spite of what happened in Greece.
The European Union with the Soviet Union is an insult of all those that have suffered in the Soviet tyranny and all those millions that have died. I think Mr. Bloom, Mr. Speaker, should apologize to all those people that he actually insulted. Thank you.
Thank you. I fully agree with you. Our next speaker is Mr. Bokros for 1 minute.
When the Spanish Prime Minister José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero inaugurated the Spanish presidency in Strasbourg, he was making a speech about Europe 2020 without mentioning with one word why on earth the Lisbon strategy failed in the first place. Then I asked him the question, how can one possibly analyze and come up with a new strategy without analyzing the failure of a previous one? Now I have no choice but to repeat my question because the new document does not say a word why this failure happened. So please, Senor Garriga, if you can answer my question, why it is possible and how it is possible to establish a new, very ambitious set of goals without analyzing first the reasons for the failure of the Lisbon strategy. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Mr. Bokros. Mr. De Jong now for 1 minute.
Voorzitter, ik daag de commissie en de raad uit 5 duidelijke keuzes te maken.
Thank you. Commission, Council, you've come to clear decisions. But what sort of democracy are we talking about? Let's find out from the Council about decisions having an effect on social legislation in Member States. It's gone on for decades without the citizens being involved in the process. The Dutch Prime Minister decided 10 years ago what was going to go on for the following decade in the Netherlands. We've got to have more employment, it was stated. That sounds good, but it seems as though there are more and more poor workers and unemployed. So what about official data? 5.8% increase in the budget. Is that right? Now the Commission, you're talking about the internal market more social and making sure that public calls for tenders bear in mind the social side more and fighting poverty. You only look at economic growth though, basically, but economic growth, so-called, means that managers get more wages, higher wages and bonuses, but workers get nothing. How are you going to change that?
Per affrontare in modo costruttivo il problema.
To look at this constructively in jobs, first of all, react, develop and monitor. We have to stop, therefore, Euro propaganda and find real ways to tackle citizens' problems. Guarantee a real link between training and local business requirements, and still allow people to have entry and not say that manual professions have some sort of stigma attached. You've got to ease access of workers to the labour market with some sort of contractual security linked to real market needs. And people who've lost jobs have to be looked to as well. Member States have got to look to policies on immigration and bear in mind the real needs for immigration. There are 3 million unemployed, so why not think about the possibility for a few years just stopping third country immigration? That's the only way in which we can protect our jobs and social systems. We need to be specific, have courage and focus in. Thank you.
Mr. Marinescu, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Sustainable economic growth requires massive investment and coherence, also in the transport sector. Transport sector represents 10% of the EU's GDP and is translated into over 10 million jobs. I invite the Commission and the Council that while defining the EU 2020 strategy, they should also take into account the following aspects that have to do with this field of transportation. Promoting research, innovation and development in order to reach the stage of the so-called green transportation, meeting the European decarbonization goal by financing alternative means of transport, green means of transport, intelligent, smart traffic management systems, etc. Better coordination between infrastructures in order to promote the protection of the environment, but also the safety and security of passengers. As far as specifics are concerned, let me emphasize the following aspects. We should speed up the implementation of the single sky as well as the interoperability in the railway sector. We should improve the quality of the roads in Europe and the security on the roads especially. We should implement co-modality and we should extend the highways of the seas. We should speed up the sustainable development of urban mobility. The Commission must think of all these aspects that have to do with mobility, because mobility should be one of the central elements of the EU 2020 strategy. A coordinated development of the transportation sector is the key for sustainable development and for creation of new and stable jobs. Thank you very much.
Madam Podimata, for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, President. Allow me, first of all, as a Greek woman, to express my deep sorrow given the tragic events that took place in my country that meant that 3 people died because they were trapped in a bank when extreme people infiltrated a peaceful demonstration and set fire to the bank. I do understand that the whole of Europe and European mass media are looking at what is happening in Greece, and that is why I would like to ask people to show responsibility, a sense of responsibility, solidarity and respect to the Greek people who are going through very difficult moments. I'm saying this because I believe that in European newspapers and in European capitals tomorrow people will take advantage of these tragic events and say that now they are not very sure whether Greece can implement the difficult decisions it took. in order to put its economy and budget right. Because after the agreement on Sunday, we've had the same old story that's been going on since the 11th of February. There have been a lot of comments on how the measures are not going to be effective. There have been rumors that our debt will have to be restructured. There have been rumors that Greece will withdraw from the euro, and there have been attacks on the markets not only against Greek bonds but also against Spanish and Portuguese bonds. And colleagues, since we are discussing the outlook for the future and Europe 2020, my question is, what is going to happen in the future if national economies depend so much on international markets? There is a lack of accountability in the system, and credit rating agencies do not bear the consequences of their ratings, even though sometimes the ratings are wrong, and sometimes they're wrong for the European and Euro countries too.
1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, President. During the past 2 years, we've seen the most serious world economic crisis. Therefore, it is vital to focus our efforts in order to have competitiveness and to support the potential for growth. Our objectives need to be realistic, and this is why they need to be defined in correlation with the national objectives of the member states, which are established depending on the specific needs of each member state. EU objectives should be split according to national objectives. I asked for new measures such as sanctions for member states who do not apply the EU 2020 strategy and incentives for those states who do apply it. This way, we should have a compatibility with the objectives of the strategy. But we should also think that the policy of cohesion is very important for our objectives. We need to look at the Commission's proposals so that a proposal such as the automatic suspension of structural funds in case of deficit is an unrealistic measure, because we mean to reduce disparities between member states. Thank you.
Next speaker is Mr. Vlasák for 1 minute.
No.
Thank you, Mr. President. The European Union is in population terms the biggest geopolitical entity in the world. Our economies are able to develop their innovation and their exports, but we have to be humble given the competition with the United States, Japan, China, India and Brazil. I believe that the strategy should continue to remain focused on economic growth and jobs. Social issues and climate change should not detract attention from these principal objectives. At the same time, we need to realize that intelligent and sustainable growth in the member states, regions and local areas is not possible without proper infrastructure, be it transport infrastructure or environmental infrastructure. The EU 2020 strategy does not satisfactorily cover this, nor does it properly cover the need for investment, continued investment in the infrastructure in those states and regions which remain underdeveloped. Thank you.
Mr. Higgins is next for 1 minute.
The EU Commission has for Europe up to 2020 is reliance on neoliberal capitalism and the market system. In other words, the exact same factors that have plunged the world into the current economic chaos and illustrated in the Commission and EU government's response to the financial crisis in Greece. A shameful capitulation to the speculation and profiteering by the sharks in the financial markets, demanding that the Greek working class pensioners and poor should have their services and living standards savaged to feed the insatiable greed of these financial markets, which are not some kind of an all-powerful god, as media commentators would have us believe, but investment banks, hedge fund operators, bondholders and the like, parasites seeking super profits by deliberately speculating to create financial instability and then exploiting that to bleed working people. Is this the Europe we want for 2020? Pathetic to hear Mr Barroso appeal to them for responsibility, ask a shark to give up its taste for blood. The fight back by the Greek working class should be supported by workers all over Europe. We have to break the dictatorship of the market. That will be done not by idiots burning banks, but by sustained and mass mobilisations and strike action of working people, and replacing this diseased system with democratic socialism and a real human society to be created by 2020. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Mr. Paška for 1 minute. With all respect to the documents we have at our disposal, it's hard to ignore the similarity with former Eastern Bloc 5-year plans. They were often unsuccessful, and new ambitious objectives were set up, and the people were persuaded that this time it would work out, but it didn't. Strategy after strategy, the economy continued to plummet. This is because the strategies didn't respect basic economic rules. Europe is struggling in spite of the fact that, in comparison with China and India, it has a better educated population. The reason is because the European Council and the European Commission have a penchant for setting up new institutions and offices. Educated people, millions of educated people who could be creative in innovative and development sectors, while away their time pushing paper in offices and squandering public money. Ladies and gentlemen, if we want to be more successful, then we have to simplify the rule book, simplify the entrepreneurial environment, reduce the administrative burden. We need to allow space for independence, initiative, entrepreneurship, creativity. Thank you. Thank you. The next speaker, Mr. Karas, 2 minutes.
President, ladies and gentlemen, a Europe, or a union, the union part of Europe, is looking to growth, sustainable employment, cohesion and competitiveness. That's really what we're looking to. 2020 is not an aim in itself. 2020 has to be a means to an end, and therefore we have to go back to Robert Schuman. The goals there have to be as clear now as they were in the days of Mr. Schuman. We need to get together to look to the future, look at all the pending points, where the shoe pinches, and get over those. So we've got to have specific, financeable, sustainable instruments. That's got to be a response to the crisis. We've got to have monitorable, punishable if you don't get their goals. 2020 has got to have specific goals for employment, research, sustainable competitiveness, and the rest. We've got to get that going, up and running. I mean, we need some sort of treasury support from all member states and in the union, a genuine treasury, if we're going to be able to finance our future. We've got to know what we must finance, why we need the money. And in Europe 2020, we need to be able to look over national budgets, look to research, tax, energy, innovation, social policies. For all this, we need full support for the measures, as mentioned by Olli Rehn. 2020 has to be an expression of a new joint political will, and it should be our response to the unfortunately recrudescent nationalism and egoisms. Let's complete the internal market and go towards the economic and monetary union and have a strong economic union as part of a political union. We need that, not more nor less.
Signor Cofferati, 2 minuti, prego.
2 minutes, Cofferati. Thank you very much indeed, President. I must frankly state that when I look at the June summit, I'm perplexed. I don't see anything new of a level which will correct the problems of the Spring Council. The recommendations there were already disappointing because there was no link with a minimum amount of what you should come out of critical analysis as to the limits of Lisbon and the effects of lack of implementation of some of the most important portions politically and culturally which were drafted then. And quite apart from the crisis, there are 10 general points with no logical interconnection, a sort of aggregate of good intent, but not really specific or well defined. We don't see the need or the perceived need yet to have priorities. Europe has got to be competitive in a global system, so you've got to have social cohesion. Now that's a priority, it's fundamental to competitiveness. Without cohesion, no country, let alone a supranational aggregate of countries, will be able to compete. Because within it, with its own corpus, there will be conflicts going on which will mean it would lose competitiveness continually. And then we've got to look at innovation. It's not just a word, an expression. You've got to have specific goals, which we don't have. We don't have any quantification of amounts to go into production, not the process of production, or even the final end of how much product we want. Okay, you've got to have goods and services, and the population has got to be able to participate and get goods and get services. Otherwise, you're not going to have the cohesion to compete. Another point which has not been mentioned, ambitious goals are feasible if there's political integration. Nobody's mentioned that, member states. That's been put into the back burner. We've seen the results in Greece.
Grazie. Pan Strejček.
Mr. Strejček has 1 minute.
Pane předsedající.
Mr. President, Commissioner, I come from a member state where until the age of 28, 29, I lived in a system based on central planning. Life went on in 5-year plans. 5-year plan followed 5-year plan, because no 5-year plan was ever fulfilled. Forgive me for being a little oversensitive about central planning and about the idea of painting a picture of Europe in 2020. I'm sure the debate is interesting, but it is blinding us to what is happening today in Greece and the whole Eurozone. I've been following the debate in the chamber very closely indeed. I'm hearing calls for more Europe, more centralization, more central management and planning. And at this point in time, I think we actually need less centralization, more faith in the market. We need more market. We need more market mechanisms. Because everything that is happening now in the European Union, in the Eurozone and beyond, in the United States of America and elsewhere, all of this is an example of the failure of state intervention. Thank you.
Señora del Castillo, 2 minutos.
Gracias. Thank you, President. Many colleagues who have spoken are wondering why the Lisbon agenda failed, and many feel that maybe we should analyze why it failed before we take steps forward. Now, when it comes to the Lisbon agenda, I feel that it was an icon, a mere icon trapped in a bubble. It wasn't fleshed out in practice, and what happened is that on the one hand we had something that existed in theory, in other words the Lisbon agenda, which we all refer to, but then on the other hand in practice we didn't put any of this into practice and didn't flesh any of this out. So on the basis of this experience we've garnered, the Europe 2020 strategy will only take off if there is very strong support from all the European political institutions and the political institutions in the member states. There has to be full commitment, and there has to be full commitment that we should be able to check. We need to be able to assess this, and we need information on all of this, and there needs to be a capacity to make the necessary changes when commitments aren't honored, when we start to fail, so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where things aren't working. So either we all agree that this common project needs the tools that I've explained, or we will find ourselves in a similar situation to what happened to the Lisbon agenda.
Thank you, President. The title under which we had the Lisbon strategy was competitiveness, a very unilateral sort of declared economic strategy, which unfortunately in part has failed. Now we've got EU 2020 strategy, and under the label of sustainability, and that I think is the right path. I think gives a better balance between economic, social and the ecological developments and what's going on there and the needs there. I think sustainability, unfortunately, has the minus as just a general expression. It could just be an empty shell. But we've got to put flesh on the bones. And I think the Commission's paper is much too vague there. There's a whole series of things, Tessera and the Mosaic are failing. And it's not possible to implement, therefore. Resource-efficient Europe is good. We lack energy. We lack raw materials. But also the aims fail and the instruments fail. We don't have we don't have the aims and we don't have the instruments, and we've got to look to that when it comes to reduction and consumption. I hope in June we'll get some more flesh on the bones for that. We have more specific knowledge of what we still have to do, what the Commission is doing, what Parliament should be doing, and what Member States are doing. I think we've lost sight a bit of the fact of the capital of the environment. That is an asset. Water, air, the earth are resources, and that seems to have totally disappeared. I hope the Environment Committee will actually say a bit more, pipe up about what we should be doing there. And biodiversity strategy seems to have failed, and we're trying to enunciate a new one by 2020, and it should be involved. Climate protection, that has become much more of a salient point. I think we should really go down to 20%. We need some sort of binding nature when it comes to energy efficiency measures. It's still too vague on that. It's got to be made binding. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Pan Piotrowski. Proszę.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, the Europe 2020 strategy is ideological in nature. The goals are noble, increasing more qualified graduates, spending more on innovation. But there are no sanctions on, no penalties for countries which fail to meet the objectives. You can't help thinking that the authors of the strategy haven't noticed this serious crisis in Greece and tomorrow possibly Spain and Portugal, which could lead to the collapse of the Eurozone and maybe even the European Union. At such a critical moment in the history of the EU, people are talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 30%, which is going to strangle the economies of Central and Eastern Europe, including Poland. Cohesion policy is also heading for trouble. The 2020 strategy is a utopian socialist project. I hope it doesn't do any more damage before going the same way as the Lisbon strategy. Thank you, Mrs. Hübner.
Strategy to be effective, creating strong links between its objectives and available policy tools is, in my view, essential. And I see four main policy tools as delivery mechanisms for the EU 2020 strategy. First, the most important is the internal market regulation that stimulates competition and economic dynamism and which recognises social obligations that result from economic integration. And I would like to strongly support what Malcolm Harbour said. Secondly, this is capital investment in transport, energy and telecommunications infrastructures. We need capital investment on an unprecedented scale. Both public and private financing must be therefore mobilised. In particular, public-private partnerships must be strongly promoted, and European financial institutions must be strengthened to overcome growth funding barriers generated by deficit and debt bias of national budgets. Third, this is public expenditure through the European budget. As the EU's objectives are primarily horizontal and not sectorial, EU budget expenditures should be based on an integrated approach to development, be combined with strengthened financial engineering instruments, and promote opening of our economies to global competition. Fourth, this is the coordination of national budget expenditures in priority areas through open method of coordination. However, the soft mechanism of this method, even if improved, can unfortunately take us only some way towards agreed objectives of EU 2020. Hence, it can only be a supporting tool. European coordination must be focused on areas where genuine European value added exists or can develop, and where it will not undermine competition. Available policy tools must be used in a way guaranteeing that the trap of a strong interventionist growth model driven by traditional sectorial industrial policy is avoided. This could undermine investment and business attractiveness of Europe, reducing its growth potential. And EU 2020 must be a growth and jobs strategy because there is no other option. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arif has also 2 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, chers collègues.
President, ladies and gentlemen, the current financial, economic and social crisis is unprecedented. It affects the whole continent, its population, and leads to huge human difficulties. And unfortunately, Greece is a brutal and shameful example for us. Unemployment is spiraling out of control, and we need to come up with a strong and coordinated political response, taking into account the current serious environmental crisis that exists. We need a new development model. Citizens have hopes and have expectations, and this strategy should have responded to this, but unfortunately the strategy isn't ambitious enough. There doesn't seem to be high ambitions or strong will, but unfortunately this doesn't surprise me any longer. Now, the Commission and the Council have been talking about this, but I feel that this is just hiding the lack of action on your part. We need to make changes if there is to be sustainable growth. And then the external dimension is also an issue. And there is the liberal dogma that prevails over anything else. We need to fight against poverty. But you are pursuing different objectives for political reasons, wage restraint. There's an attack against multilateralism, and that leads to social dumping and fiscal dumping. This policy has led to too many people losing their jobs, relocation, and unpleasant social situations. It's extremely important to make sure that Europe is a continent of prosperity. We want Europe to change its image and give a different image to its citizens and to the rest of the world. That is the whole point behind the resolution of the Socialists and Democrats. Thank you.
Herr Seeber, bitte, 2 Minuten.
Danke, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. Well, coming up with comments from the political fringe on the right and the left. So here in this reasonable forum, I've got to put forward the right middle ideas. But if you see a comparison between 2020 strategy with a communist 5 years plan, really you've got to react and say, look at the economic policy, read history, and you can see the real differences. And if you hear from that side over there, on the left-hand side, not the reasonable who are sort of a bit left from us, but right on the left fringe, saying that we've got to go back to the communist utopian days. Unfortunately, in Europe, we suffered under that, and we know what came out of communism. You can wish for a lot, but basically, we've got to make a decent life, a reasonably prosperous life available to our citizens with decent education and a decent society. Therefore, it's necessary that review the political system. How, with the available resources, how can we best allocate them? And that's what we're trying to do, to plan. Each family and each local region will have to think what they're going to do with their region so that over a certain period of time they will make progress. And that's the right, reasonable way forward. So far it was a sort of limited market economy, not an unbridled one. And I think so far we can say it's the only system which will give us what we want over the longer term. That's why it's reasonable. At European level, we should think about how we can organize this sort of market society in Europe. Thinking purely national borders is not, it's just doomed to failure now. So how can we make a European market which serves people? We're not talking about competitiveness as a goal in itself. It's competitive Europe so that we can do what people need and supply what people need, do the necessary. And I think that's got to be borne in mind by colleagues. I think you know, it's okay to make generalities and statements, but I'd ask the fringe to think about it a bit more.
Madam Ticău is our next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Astăzi, în Uniunea Europeană, rata șomajului.
Today, unemployment has reached 10% in the European Union, and it is 20% among young people. The 1st of May, the International Workers' Day, was a sad day this year because the EU has 23 million unemployed people. In order to create jobs, we must think clearly in which fields we want to invest. It is only by means of education that we can give younger generations the competences they need to get a job and to have a decent life. Investment in agriculture will also allow the Union to be self-sustainable as far as food and biofuels are concerned. Investment in the transport infrastructure is vital also. This year we are reviewing the 10T list of projects. The Union needs a high-speed railway structure that should cover all the capitals of the member states as well as the great European cities. We also need to modernize, to improve the road structure, our harbors and our airports. The Union should also invest with priority in the development of the transportation structure in the Eastern Europe, because this is the only way in which we will have a truly efficient common market. All these projects, of course, need huge financial resources, but these resources will generate profits for the budgets by means of taxes, and they will also create jobs and economic development. Investment in the energy infrastructure and in energy efficiency and renewable energies will also reduce the Union's energy dependency and shall generate approximately 2.7 billion new jobs by 2030. However, instead of investing in the Smart Cities initiative, we see that over 150 million euros from the economic relaunch plan have not been spent. Last but not least, the Union should invest in research and sustainable development of European industry. Chairman, I would like to conclude by asking the Commission and the Council if they can create an instrument that is similar to the Global Change Adjustment Fund in order to support public servants who lost their jobs due to the economic crisis. Thank you very much.
Madam Győri.
Thank you. Colleagues, I think we all know that a major task lies ahead of us. In the European Union and in the Member States, we need a strategy which will deal with the aftermath of the crisis, as well as enabling the EU to be competitive in the global economic environment. That means securing a better standard of living for our citizens, even in the short term. There are a couple of things I'd like to say, because the Europe 2020 strategy lays a fitting foundation for what we need to do. It needs to be ambitious and realistic, but it also has to bear in mind the differences between the different member states. For instance, poverty means different things in Bulgaria and in the UK. Education systems vary. And I'm not sure that a 40% target for university graduates is appropriate. We might simply be swelling the ranks of the unemployed. Secondly, the EU's internal cohesion and convergence should be promoted. We need to support those sectors which are engines of development in the EU. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that between the 27 member states there are major developmental differences, and we have to concentrate on these differences. Without cohesion within the EU, there won't be competitiveness with the outside world. We need new markets, new demand, innovatory potential to help less developed regions, to enable them to benefit from the internal market. I'm sure they can become competitive, and there'll be a place for this new strategy.
2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we are speaking about the vision of the European Union in 10 years' time. Today, unemployment, particularly among young people, is a major issue in the EU. Unfortunately, this makes us describe today's young people very often as the lost generation of modern times. We speak about the promotion of youth initiative, about support to the system of education and other important elements. However, usually we speak about these things as isolated issues. We fail to see the general picture. Unfortunately, when we speak about the strategy 2020, I keep worrying that this will remain an empty rhetoric if we fail to hear the young people, people who will have to implement this strategy. Strategy 2020 should be seen as a synergy of economics and ecology, so that young people could employ their knowledge and skills to create the future of the European Union. As I am a representative of the young people, I would like to present some specific proposals. First of all, let us support the creation of the so-called green jobs. That is, let us look for better ways to support businesses that create green employment and employ young people, be it in agriculture, industry, transport or services. Second, let us give more attention to the environmental protection and environmental awareness raising. By these two measures alone, we'll attract more young people into the creation of a modern economy, green economy. I would be willing to hear less skepticism and unmeasured comparisons in the European Parliament. I would like to hear more determination, optimism and concentration. Thank you.
Now our catch the eye procedure. Colleagues, I have about 19 requests and I can't accommodate even half of you, so just be patient and tolerant with me. I will try as much as I can. Let's start with Mr. Luhan for a minute. And keep to 1 minute, please, so that your colleagues can also have the floor.
Mr. President, esteemed colleagues, I'm convinced that Europe in 2020 will be stronger and more innovative. I think we will overcome the crisis because we have a huge potential as concerns an innovative workforce and resources, and I appreciate the efforts of the Commission. But I have to mention the cohesion policy and to express my insatisfaction with the fact that the road to Lisbon seems to have changed. Social and local cohesion involves other things apart from intelligent and inclusive growth. Our citizens say that they still need investments in infrastructure, access to services and development of all areas, no matter how isolated they might be. This is why in 2007-2013 we have seen the importance of infrastructure and supporting economic competitiveness for convergence areas. Interdependency of economies makes these necessary.
Vă mulțumesc.
Mulțumesc. Madam Rapti, for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. I would like to express my condolences here in the chamber. I'm expressing these condolences because of the 3 Greeks who died in Athens, and I'm very sorry that Mr. Barroso did not express his condolences in his initial speech. I hope that Mr. Rehn will do so later on. The second thing I would like to say is that the Commission needs to speed up, because if you continue delaying solutions to the problems that Europe faces and that Greece faces, then you will be undermining the targets of 2020. 2020 is based on 2010. Our poverty reduction target is based on the situation now, and with the measures that Greece has to take, it won't be able to contribute to attaining these targets. It is your obligation to help Greece, because otherwise this 40% rate of people who need to graduate will not be attained. People will not get a job.
Thank you, President. Mr. Barroso talked about actions linked to Europe 2020, which we have to resort to. But then he left the room. And I think one of the most important actions was not there. I think the call upon the Spanish presidency and thank the presidency for being here and following this debate right to the end. But one of the most important points, by way of action, which must happen under 2020, is that sustainable development should be used in order to get the green job potential which is available. Therefore, we need a thorough initiative for green jobs potential. We have to state that here change has to be borne in mind. You've got to look at workers' rights in this whole process. And there should be initiative to further education, vocational training. And I know the Belgian and Spanish presidencies are working on this, but I would really frankly support that. Continue on that and put it up as a council initiative this year.
Mr. Bufton now, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, we're discussing Europe 2020, which will be in 10 years' time. I think we ought to reflect perhaps in the last 10 hours. It is with great sadness that I learned of the deaths in Greece. Very sad, and I feel sorry for the families, and my condolences go to the families and friends of those poor people that died. However, I did warn of civil unrest a few weeks back in the Parliament over the situation with the Eurozone and the problems it now faces. I think it's time that this Parliament, the Commission and the Council woke up to the fact that the Eurozone is flawed, it's not working. We've seen problems in Greece. I feel it will carry on to Spain, and before more lives are lost, is it not time for some honesty here, and that we really look at the situation regarding Eurozone countries and admit that it is flawed? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Borys, Piotr Borys.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The EU economy is still the strongest economy. However, our El Dorado is not eternal. The crisis, the events in Greece have shown up our shortcomings, and we need to learn lessons. We need to be ambitious and resolute in implementing the successor to the Lisbon strategy. We need to make sure that in future people can have the same standard of living. I'm not sure about the targets in the area of higher education when 30% of Europe's citizens don't have qualifications at all. I really believe that we need to be swift and resolute. All the Union institutions and Member States have to be resolute in meeting the education objectives.
Pani Flašíková-Beňová.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. It's a shame that the President of the Commission didn't stick around. I'm sure he has important things to do, but I would have thought EU 2020 was the most important strategic material on the table. I can't imagine what he's doing that's more important. I'm afraid the EU 2020 strategy has not been well received in the European Parliament. The situation in Europe is difficult, and the document has been drawn up against the backdrop of one of the worst ever economic crises in living memory in Europe. The strategy needs to protect those who are most vulnerable, people who lived in difficult conditions before the crisis, who are not to blame for the crisis and who are still facing difficulty. I would say, therefore, that we need to get poverty and social exclusion provisions of the document into the main body of the document. It shouldn't just be a side alley. It should be at the heart of what we're doing. Thank you.
And finally, Madam Morvai.
Köszönöm szépen. Az Európa jövőjéről szóló stratégia két.
Thank you, President. The strategy looking to the future of Europe is based on two values, a set of values, if you will. And they're very difficult to reconcile one with the other. You've got to decide one way or the other. Competitiveness, globalization. I mean, that is one way of summing up one complex, and sustainability a way of summing up the other side, the other complex of values. And I think forcing globalization has a very bad effect on the environment. It's not sustainable. Sustainability is not the way to describe it. You can talk about SMEs who can't keep up with globalization and competitiveness. They just fall out of that particular universe. And I don't think really that's something we should contemplate. If we're looking at sustainability and social sustainability, you've got to really pronounce yourself in the favour of that.
Mr. López Garrido for the Council to sum up the discussion and answer some of those questions that were raised.
Thank you, President. I'd like to start off by answering the direct question put by Mr. Potros. Mr. Cofferati also touched upon this. He's not in the chamber at the moment, and Mrs. Castillo del Vera also talked about this, but she's not here either. Many talked about why Lisbon failed. And that's the direct question I got from Mr. Bogos. There are probably several reasons, and perhaps it would be excessively arrogant to try and want to simplify it. But if I had to pick one of those reasons, I would say that the one that better explains or best explains the failure is the following. The EU adopted a single market, a single currency at the time, but it hasn't taken other necessary steps. The Maastricht Treaty talked about an economic and monetary union. We achieved a monetary union, but not an economic union, and I think that's part of the problem. We haven't really achieved an economic union. That is why Europe 2020 will mark a new era in the EU, that of an economic union, and we need to have this in mind. And a fundamental part of an economic union is a strategy for creating jobs, and that is why this has been part of the debate. I found the debate extremely interesting and extremely fruitful. There are a lot of interesting ideas. I believe that there are new dimensions in Europe 2020 that didn't exist in Lisbon, or at least the emphasis wasn't right. The social dimension, technological issues, Mr. Cercas and Mr. Cofferati talked about this, so did Mr. Arif. And there's also climate change and the fight against climate change. And I fully agree with what Mrs. Schroeder said. However, having a strategy like the one I explained is not enough for an economic union. So I would say to Mrs. Harms, who isn't here, that that is the case. It isn't enough. You need more. Mr. Rehn is going to speak later, and he's already been working on coordinating economic policies, job policies, and social policies. And that is necessary. That didn't happen in Europe before, and the Lisbon Agenda didn't lead to it. And Article 5 of the TFEU stipulates that EU member states must, it is obligatory for them to coordinate their economic policies and employment policies. And if necessary, they can also coordinate their social policies. And to my mind, they need to do that. So not only do we need an employment creation strategy, we also need to supervise financial markets. And that is why we have the supervision package, which I referred to before, and Mr. Verhofstadt also picked up on it. And I'm very pleased that the European Parliament is involved in this, and I hope that the European Parliament will adopt the financial supervisory package very soon. Mr. Barroso also talked about something that I would like to mention. We need to have an external dimension here. The economic union needs to have an external dimension. There needs to be representation in the G20 summit. I would like to repeat what Mr. Barroso said, because I fully agree, so I endorse what he said. If there is to be an economic union, we also need institutions for governance. A council that goes for the guidelines, the Commission monitors and supervises the implementation of the strategy, and we also need a legislative body or legislative bodies, the Council and the Parliament, involved in this. We also need the necessary instruments to promote the strategy, for example, the authorization of the European funds and structural funds in order to show the right way ahead. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case with the Lisbon strategy. I think that this is happening already. The EU is on the right track, and we have to move towards the next stage where not only do we need a monetary union, we need an economic union. That is what we need to achieve. We need to do this coherently and consistently on the basis of interinstitutional dialogue. And an example of this is what is happening this afternoon. And we have to go about this in a speedy fashion. That is what European citizens want from us and expect from us. Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. Commissioner Rehn has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, Minister, honourable members. Let me thank you for a very rich and responsible debate this evening. And let me also correct one claim concerning President Barroso. He did express his condolences on the behalf of the Commission, and I want to join him and express my condolences to the families and friends of the victims of violence in Athens today. Disagreement in democracy is normal, but the recourse to violence is never acceptable. Ladies and gentlemen, sustainable growth and job creation is indeed at the heart of Europe 2020, And I want to say some words about financial stability, which is a necessary condition of returning to sustainable growth and to the goals of Europe 2020. You may call it Europe 2010, because we need that in order to succeed as Europe 2020. The decision on the euro area member states last Sunday to activate the mechanism of coordinated and conditional financial assistance for Greece was not an easy but a necessary decision. It was a responsible and the right thing to do. The Commission's task is now to ensure that the bilateral loans will be coordinated and that conditionality will be systematically and rigorously applied. The financial support gives Greece a breathing space to restore the sustainability of its public finances as well as its overall economic competitiveness. This is needed not only for Greece but in order to safeguard financial stability in Europe, to avoid that the bushfire in Greece could turn into a forest fire in Europe. Financial stability is necessary for Europe's ongoing economic recovery, for sustainable growth and job creation. Some of you mentioned the contagion effect and concerns related to other countries of the euro area or of the European Union. No one can deny that there are tensions in the financial markets in the recent days and weeks, but as often in the financial markets there is significant overshooting. All euro area member states are taking measures to consolidate their public finances, not least Portugal and Spain. Greece is a unique and particular case in the euro area, and now the European Union, especially the euro area member states, together with the Commission and ECB and IMF, are taking care of the Greek case, and I am confident that we will succeed and overcome the formidable challenges. We must also learn the lessons of the crisis. That's important for economic governance of Europe 2020, and the latest developments in the European economy, not least in or around Greece, have shown that there is a pressing and urgent need to strengthen economic governance in Europe. Next week the Commission will make concrete proposals on how we can reinforce economic policy coordination and member states' budgetary surveillance in the European Union. In the Economic and Monetary Union, the M has been much stronger than the E. It is high time to fill the E with life. This was also the underlying idea of the founding fathers of the Economic and Monetary Union. Our guiding principle is that prevention is always more effective than correction, and therefore we will build our proposals on the basis of reinforcing prevention as well as also correction. The main building blocks of our proposal are three. First, we need to reinforce the Stability and Growth Pact, both its preventive and corrective arms. We need a more systematic and rigorous preventive budgetary surveillance so that cases like the Greek case can never happen again. Second, we must go beyond budgetary surveillance. We need to address macroeconomic imbalances and divergences in competitiveness, and therefore we need to reinforce both export competitiveness which is urgently needed in many countries, and domestic demand where needed and possible. The third building block will be a crisis resolution mechanism. The financial mechanism for Greece serves the immediate need for the current purposes. However, it is clear and necessary that we need to set up a permanent crisis resolution mechanism with strong inbuilt conditionalities and also disincentives for its use. But as President Barroso said earlier today, it is better to be safe than sorry and ensure that we are also equipped to face even the worst scenarios. In conclusion, Madam President, honourable members, I count on your support. I count on the European Parliament to support reinforcing economic governance in Europe. And I also call on the heads of state and government of the euro area member states on Friday, as well as the European Council more broadly, to support our proposals and proceed rapidly without delay in making these proposals effective and a reality. Why so? Because we have no luxury of time, and instead I urge everyone to take decisions as soon as possible so that we can make Europe 2020 a success and create real foundations for sustainable growth and job creation in Europe. That is what our citizens are expecting from us. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you very much for referring to the situation in Greece, and thank you very much for the condolences you extended to the families and friends of the victims. The vote will take place during May 2, the vote on this item. So now I would like to ask you for a 5-minute break for technical reasons. So we will adjourn for 5 minutes for technical reasons.